Hello, I'm Sandra Lee with miracleinspirations.com and the Breathe Life's Inspirations blog. Today I am doing Facebook Live on a topic that was brought to mind by listening to someone give recommendations for how we can help our memory. And when talking about memory, what is often not talked about is overall protecting brain function. So that's what I want to talk about today, protecting brain function. In my opinion, the most important thing you can do to protect your brain function, to help your brain continue to function well into old age, is to eat properly. So I had a whole Facebook Live series about eating and food. Now I'm going to talk about this from the perspective of how can we help our brains to continue to function for our full lives and allow us to live well into older age with clarity of thought and ability to use our brains the way we want to be able to use them. Let's talk about a book that I read a really long time ago. And it is a book called Excitotoxins, The Taste That Kills by a man named Russell Blaylock. He is a very well-known neurosurgeon. He hasn't been very much talked about in recent times, but I learned a tremendous amount from this book and I will always remember it. Excitotoxins, The Taste That Kills. And one of the things that really struck me about this book is he said that for you to have a symptom associated with your brain, I'm going to say for you to have a symptom associated with loss of function of your brain, you have to have lost 90% of the neurons associated with that function. For you to have symptoms associated with loss of function in an area of your brain, you have to have lost 90% of the neurons that perform that function. It's possible that there is more recent science than that because that book was written quite a long time ago. But whatever the actual number is, that is really important. For you to have a symptom associated with loss of some function of your brain, you have to have lost a massive percentage of the neurons that perform that function. So that means that by the time you have symptoms associated with your brain not functioning properly or associated with memory loss, you have already lost a tremendous percentage of the neurons in your brain that perform that function. Which says to me, it is really, really important to me to protect the neurons that I still have. Protect the brain, the neurons in your brain that you have now, wherever you are. Even if you already have lack of clarity or difficulty with memory, protect every neuron in your brain that you still have. This is a critical priority. This also means that since how we eat is the biggest influence on brain function and continued brain function throughout our whole lives, eating to protect brain function matters. When people are young, they don't tend to pay attention to these things. They're not important. They think they are invincible. Young people think they are invincible, and they do not want to give up the things that they want, the pleasures that they want in the moment, because as far as they're concerned, they don't matter. All they care about is now. But if you have children, teens, young adults, and you are able to influence their eating habits and their eating patterns, help them to understand that it matters later. They will care later when the time comes that their brains are not working properly. So encourage them to develop healthy eating habits now, wherever you are in your life. Child, young adult, you can always improve the quality of the food that you eat now and for the rest of your life. Because every neuron in your brain that you protect from damage, from dying, is a brain cell that will continue to serve you later. Protect every brain cell that you have now. So going back to Excitotoxins, The Taste That Kills, the book that I learned so much from, written by Russell Blaylock. This book, Excitotoxins, The Taste That Kills, talks about excitotoxins. Excitotoxins are chemicals that cause, neurochemicals that cause the brain to be excited into function. And it's very important that we be able to excite the neurons in our brains to function, because that's critical for normal function, normal operation, and for brain development ongoingly. So it's like my brain has already functioned, but I need excitotoxins to be able to function properly in my brain, for me to be able to live, to be able to have healing happen, for normal function. Excitation of those neurons is a necessary part of function. So what are excitotoxins and how do they cause this excitation of brain function? If we think about a chemical that is commonly used in food, monosodium glutamate, MSG. MSG has in it glutamate. And glutamate is an amino acid, a protein component. And in the brain, and even in the rest of the body, glutamate serves an excitatory function. It stimulates nerves to excite them and causes them to function. It's part of how neurochemicals signal operation, things to happen in the body and in the brain. So glutamate, this basic amino acid, is an excitatory neurochemical. When we eat glutamate in any form, but certainly in the form of monosodium glutamate, which is what I'm talking about now, but it's in any form. Glutamate is a component of proteins. It's an amino acid. And it is very important for us to have some of this, a limited amount of this glutamate, because again, it supports ongoing brain function. So the amount of this neurotransmitter in the brain is very carefully controlled, because we need some all of the time, but we don't want too much. Think about this excitotoxin, excitatory function of this glutamate. It causes a neuron to function and fire. It excites it into function. But again, we only want a small amount of this available to be used at any given time. Not all neurons in the brain are stimulated in function by glutamate. There are glutamate neurons and non-glutamate neurons. I think it's probably a small percentage of the neurons in the brain that are excited by glutamate. So there are areas of the brain where you have damage that occurs that causes dementia. The areas of the brain that tend to lose brain tissue contributing to dementia are glutamate neurons. Those neurons respond to the presence of glutamate in this excitatory fashion. So what happens when glutamate is present in higher than normal quantities? Say, if I eat something that has MSG. If you look at if you watch one of my earlier Facebook Live videos where I talked about MSG, I talked about all the forms of food ingredients that contain MSG. So say we eat these processed foods that have MSG in them. A good example will be chips, potato chips, that have all those wonderful flavorings on them that make it so you want to eat lots of it. That's because it has glutamate, monosodium glutamate in it. It creates this deliciousness response so that I want to eat a lot of it. That monosodium glutamate that's in those flavor chemicals has this glutamate that causes excitation of the neuron. So imagine I've eaten a bunch of nachos, for example, nacho cheese potato chips or corn chips. I used to eat those all the time. Okay, so I'm not I'm not virtue signaling here. You know, I am someone who is definitely guilty of eating a lot of these foods in the past. Okay, so if I've eaten a bunch of these nacho cheese chips, okay, and I've got a flood of this MSG in my body, some of that glutamate passes over the blood-brain barrier into the brain. The blood-brain barrier is a membrane that protects the brain from chemicals that are damaging, potentially damaging to it. It keeps compounds out of the brain that could cause damage. But glutamate is able to cross the blood-brain barrier. So we get an extraordinarily large amount from my nacho cheese chips, okay, of glutamate in my brain. And this glutamate goes to the neurons and causes them to be excited. Let's talk about the neurons that are sensitive to this. One of the types of neurons in the brain that is sensitive to the presence of glutamate are calcium channel neurons. So imagine I have a neuron here, and it's got a receptor site for glutamate. And glutamate comes in, and it opens the calcium channel on this neuron. And then calcium ions flood into the neuron and wake it up and excite it, which again, in normal function, we want that to happen, okay? Calcium ions flood in. Normally, how the neuron has the calcium channel closed is by the presence of magnesium. Magnesium is a mineral that in the brain causes this calcium channel to close when it doesn't need to be open anymore. Magnesium is a mineral that is deficient in almost everyone's diet. It's not present in high enough quantities in our foods. It's not even high enough it's not present in high enough quantities in our vegetables and the fruits and the plant materials that we would normally get a lot of magnesium from. So most people in our society are deficient in magnesium. So say we have a high amount of glutamate because of the nacho cheese nachos that I ate, okay? And I have insufficient magnesium. So I've had a stimulation of this calcium channel neuron from the presence of glutamate, and I don't have enough magnesium to close the calcium channel on these neurons. So the calcium channel stays open. And calcium comes flooding in, so much that the neuron swells up and it dies. The neuron swells up and dies. So there's lots of glutamate and not enough magnesium. If that state stays in my brain, then neuron after neuron after neuron dies. Now it's way more complicated than that. The brain has all kinds of mechanisms it uses to pull that excess glutamate out, okay? So hopefully it manages to do that. It uses up a lot of resources, a lot of energy, and if your brain's not able to do that, then the continued damage occurs because of the excessive amount of glutamate, okay? So if we think about, I have a brain, okay, that has over time, a little bit at a time, I have a neuron die here, neuron die there, I have nacho cheese, not chips there, then this packaged food, that packaged food, all these foods that contain MSG. They put the MSG in because it makes the food so delicious that we don't want to stop eating it. chip advertisements that talk about so delicious you can't eat just one, right? That's because it contains the glutamate and all these flavor chemicals that make it so good you don't want to stop eating. So if you are ever in a situation where you are eating something and you can't stop, if it's packaged food, chances are pretty darn high that it has this MSG in it, and you are flooding your brain with that glutamate chemical that is causing this neuron death. Okay? There's also aspartame, which is one of the artificial sweeteners. Okay? It's also an excitotoxin. It causes that excitatory response that kills brain cells. You do not want that. So how can you protect your brain function? Decrease the amount of these packaged foods that you consume. Read labels. Watch my previous Facebook Live video, which is on my YouTube channel, where I talked about MSG and all the different forms that MSG comes in, because there's a long list of them. They try to hide it in your food by not putting monosodium glutamate on the label, because people know to watch for that. But you need to be aware that there's a lot of other ingredients that contain MSG. I also learned in Excitotoxins, The Taste That Kills, that book, that an ingredient like textured vegetable protein, for example, or textured protein, or vegetable protein, or hydrolyzed protein, any of those ingredients can have, as it makes monosodium glutamate, it makes free glutamate. Just the process of hydrolyzing protein or hydrolyzing yeast or making these products, these ingredients, automatically the process of making that ingredient creates this free glutamate that causes this damage to the brain. Okay? But because they have this blanket ingredient name like hydrolyzed protein, for example, okay, they can add monosodium glutamate to it. That ingredient, say hydrolyzed protein, could have 60% be MSG. And the basic ingredient might have come from hydrolyzing protein, but they can add MSG to it. And they don't have to say MSG on the label, which means you have to be a smart consumer and read labels, understand what the suspicious ingredients are that could have MSG in it, and just don't buy those foods. Better yet, limit the amount of packaged foods that you buy to things that have ingredients that pretty much you understand what they all are. Because by the time you start having symptoms, you start having mental clarity issues or not being able to remember things, you may have had a loss of substantial numbers of your brain cells. And every brain cell that you still have is precious to you. Precious, every single one. So that's what I wanted to say today about how to protect your brain function. Certainly drinking water, sleeping well, eating well, making your own food, all those things are all really important. But anytime you are eating a packaged food that is so delicious you don't want to stop, stop if you can get yourself to do it. Or just choose to not eat those things in the first place. Now, personally, I still consume small amounts of those things because I have been taking these precautions for decades, 2-3 decades. I've been being aware of this and not eating so many of those foods. So knowing that, I am okay with having small amounts and keeping it limited. Now, I wouldn't go eat, nacho cheese chips anymore because I know that there is so much of that garbage in there. But I know that every once in a while, I will use an ingredient in cooking, for example, that probably has some suspect ingredients in it. The small amount that I'm going to consume, I'm going to trust my body's going to be able to handle. But I don't go buy things anymore that just have lots of that garbage. And that's just become part of my normal. So make good food choices. Take care of yourself. Love yourself. Oh, and get enough magnesium. Supplement with magnesium. So when I go to a restaurant, for example, where I am pretty certain that there's going to be some MSG exposure, that's just the way it is eating in restaurants, I supplement with magnesium so that my body has more magnesium to use to close the calcium channel. So that as much as possible, I can protect the brain cells that I still have. Okay, that's enough for today. Thank you, Sandra Lee with miracleinspirations.com and the Breathe Life's Inspirations blog. Check out my YouTube channel if you want, so that you can see my other Facebook Live videos. Have a wonderful day. Thank you. Bye.